In this video, we're going to talk about what a microbiome is, what it does for us, how we lose it, and how we get it back again. Our microbiome is a mix of thousands of different species of bacteria, fungi, parasites, and viruses that live symbiotically with us. Every part of the body has a microbiome. The lungs, the brain, every tissue has a microbiome. But the primary microbiome is the large intestine, and the secondary would be the small intestine. And we're going to talk about the microbiome of the large intestine. It's commonly known that the microbiome is associated with good digestion, but it's really much more than that. It's responsible for regulating virtually every system in the body, and it does this by creating and managing a staggering estimated 500,000 different metabolites, which make up about 40% of the compounds in our blood. In terms of the immune system, the microbiome has more immune cells than your blood and bone marrow combined. In terms of hormones, your microbiome has more endocrine cells than all the endocrine glands of your body combined. In terms of information processing, your microbiome is 3 times heavier than your brain, and in terms of a genetic database, your microbiome has access to 1,000 times more genetic information than your own DNA. So if the microbiome is so important, why don't we pay more attention to it? Why don't we know more about it? Well, if I asked you to draw a tree, you'd probably draw the trunk and branches and then leaves. But that's really half the tree. The other half is underground. It's the roots and then the microbiome living on the roots that live symbiotically, supporting the tree. We don't draw the lower half of the tree because we don't see it. But without the lower half, the upper half won't be able to survive. It's a whole system. The microbiome is the roots of our metabolic tree, and if our metabolic roots aren't healthy, then we can't expect to be healthy either. So, since we're here to learn how to become more healthy, let's talk about how to recover and support a healthy microbiome. Where did we get it? 1 billion years ago, when the first worms started appearing, their primitive guts became infected with bacteria, fungi, and viruses. Some of these were predatory and killed the worms. Some of them lived in the worm's guts. They didn't hurt the worms, they didn't help the worms. We call this a commensal relationship. But over time, these commensal microorganisms adapted to support the worm, to be symbiotic, to make the worm healthier and stronger and live longer, because the longer life and healthier life the worm had, the longer the bacteria and the microbiome in that worm's gut would survive. It is beneficial for the microbiome to have a healthy host. So since then, every animal with a gut, including humans, have evolved a symbiotic microbiome. And like the worms initially, our microbiome gave us better digestion and protected us from predatory microorganisms. But over time, it learned how to improve our health as well. It learned how to make us stronger, smarter, fight infections better, heal faster, age slower. In other words, our microbiome is the most powerful ally and valuable upgrade we will ever have. And for all the benefits it gives us, all it asks is to eat the leftovers that we can't digest in our gut. It's a fantastic deal. The microbiome is actually more than just an upgrade. It's a guide, it's a teacher. Let me explain this. I've identified 4 initiations, biological rites of passage, that our microbiome guides us through. The first initiation happens while we're inside the womb, and metabolites produced by the mother's microbiome pass through the placenta and guide our developing brain. Our neural architecture, the complexity of our brain, which gives us our intelligence, is in part due to the microbiome of the mother. The second initiation happens after we're born, and this is when IgA, the immunoglobulin in colostrum, which is the first part of breast milk, goes into the baby and teaches the baby that the newly formed microbiome is part of self. Don't attack it. This is our protection against autoimmune diseases. The third initiation is where, after we're born, our microbiome continues to guide our brain development. Unlike most animals, we don't finish myelination of our brains inside the wombs a percentage of it, a good percentage of it, happens after we're born. So our microbiome completes the myelination process of our nerves and continues to stimulate growth in the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, which is respectively cognitive behavior, personality expression, decision-making, social behavior, and memory. So a lot of what we consider what separates us from the animals in terms of our cognitive capacity is a gift of the microbiome. And then fourth, once our immune system knows what self is and when it knows what not to fight, the microbiome then teaches the immune system what it should fight, what other is. The microbiome has a very intimate role with the immune system, helping it understand what to fight and what not to fight, giving us an immune system that does not fight ourselves, which would be autoimmune, and yet does fight other infections, which is the basis of strong immunity. Now there's 4 dangers our microbiome faces in the modern world. So let's go through these so we understand how to avoid them if possible and how to ameliorate the effects if they've already happened. The first would be difficult childbirths and lack of breastfeeding. If someone's born prematurely and they spend the first few days in a hospital, instead of getting breast milk, they're getting formula and they're exposed to hospital infections. That's a person who never got a microbiome to begin with that was healthy. They have to start from scratch. A stressful childbirth can also affect the microbiome. If the child is born face up or breech, or it's a very painful delivery, that can throw off the microbiome. The other issue is a lot of people aren't getting adequate breast milk, especially that very important first colostrum. And not to give you an appreciation for breast milk, breast milk contains over 200 prebiotics, that's the food for the developing infant microbiome, and over 600 probiotics, that's bacteria, that we believe are taken from the mother's own microbiome, transported by the lymphatics into the breast milk. And breast milk can change day by day based on the needs of the infant. So if you weren't breastfed for at least a few months, your microbiome could also probably use some support. The second danger is that modern diets don't contain the food the microbiome needs to eat. Now, while we're being breastfed, the breast milk provides all the oligosaccharides, all the prebiotics. Prebiotics is another name for special sugars that the microbiome needs to eat. And these are also called oligosaccharides. And that's the term we'll use from here on out. Oligosaccharides are sugars we can't digest. So there's no loss to us when the microbiome eats them. They're the leftovers after we finish digesting, and what's left over is these oligosaccharides, and the microbiome eats them. The problem, and in primitive diets, there's lots of oligosaccharides, lots of different types of oligosaccharides and in large amounts. The problem is in a modern diet, not only isn't there the variety of oligosaccharides, but the quantity is a lot lower. So most people, their microbiomes are just barely hanging on with the very minimal amount of oligosaccharides they do get. A third danger is chronic exposure to things like glyphosates, which are actually antibiotics in the gut, artificial sugars, which the microbiome thinks it can eat, and then it eats it and it's poisoned, pharmaceuticals, chlorinated water, these all add additional stresses to the microbiome. And then finally, antibiotics, specifically things like Cipro, which can wipe out over 50% of the species of the microbiome in a matter of days. That's an issue. So also consider if you're eating farmed meat, there's chronic low levels of antibiotics in the meat that you're eating as well. Roughly speaking, there's 2 ways in which the microbiome can adapt or respond to these stresses. One is dormancy and the other is phenotype drift. So let's talk about these 2. Dormancy is when, in response to stress, bacterial cells hibernate. They slow their metabolic activity to a near standstill and wait for the environment to improve. In this case, they're waiting for the oligosaccharides to reappear in the diet. And this is a great strategy for the microbiome because, after all, even for successful hunter-gatherers, food isn't always available. Sometimes someone's injured or they're sick or bad weather or bad luck for a few hunts in a row. So the microbiome has to have a strategy to wait out times when there's just not a lot of food. But if they are dormant long enough, this can cause problems. When bacteria become dormant, it triggers the release of compounds like polyphosphates and bradykinin, which increase gut and blood-brain barrier permeability, as well as mitochondrial permeability through the mitochondrial transition pores. They basically make everything leak. And then for some reason, we add polyphosphates to the food supply, further shutting down our mitochondria and bacteria, which is a terrible idea, but that's another conversation. Now, not all bacteria are good at hibernating, which leads to the second adaptation, which is phenotype drift. And that means they change their shape and behavior to survive their new and possibly less friendly environment. Millions of years ago, the symbiotic bacteria in our microbiome were originally parasitic in nature. When conditions in our intestines deteriorate and our symbiotic bacteria find it difficult to survive, they can access their genetic codes and shift to a more primitive parasitic form that is better suited to the environment. This is called phenotype drift. And of course, another option for stressed bacteria in the microbiome is they simply die, which creates the opportunity for parasitic bacteria to colonize us in their place. Take E. coli, for instance. There's many forms of E. coli, and the ones we get from our mother's microbiome are symbiotic with us and make excellent members of our microbiome. Those that we find in the external environment are typically parasitic and cause disease. Now, if our symbiotic E. coli dies or is diminished in number, then that biologic niche, the real estate that they inhabit in our intestines, becomes vacant, and it can become colonized by environmental E. coli. And this is not going to be the human-adapted symbiotic form that's been evolving and passed down mother to child for millions of years. It's going to be the more primitive parasitic version. Alternately, something like Candida can take up residence in the intestinal wall where the E. coli used to live. What happens if you have a stressed microbiome? Well, you'd think digestive issues, and yes, but that's actually not always the main issue. You get a loss of homeostasis, increases of toxicity, inflammation, immune dysfunction, putrefaction, small intestine bacterial overgrowth called SIBO. Let's look at these one at a time. The loss of homeostasis. The microbiome, as we mentioned, is responsible for regulating almost the entire body. Neurotransmitters, hormones, enzymes, blood sugar, immunity, all of these are regulated by the microbiome. So one of the things you find with a stressed microbiome is the person starts to lose their metabolic balance in one of many ways. Toxicity. We're taught that the liver and the kidneys are the primary detoxifying organs, but the microbiome also plays a major role in detoxifying. A healthy microbiome will break down toxins in the digestive tract before the liver and the kidneys ever see them. On the other hand, an imbalanced microbiome creates toxins like lipopolysaccharides and others. Inflammation. A healthy microbiome breaks down inflammatory molecules, and an imbalanced microbiome creates excessive ones like lipopolysaccharides, which are what gram-negative bacterial cell walls are made from. They escape through leaky gut membranes and cause systemic inflammation in the body. Immune dysfunction. There are many ways in which the microbiome manages our immunity. Let's take parasites as an example. Parasites are an ancient adversary. While our mammalian immune system is 200 million years old, parasites have been infecting us and our pre-mammalian ancestors for over 500 million years. And in that immense time frame, they've learned a lot of strategies to evade, suppress, attack, and distract our immune system. One trick parasites have is they can vary their surface proteins so our immune system doesn't recognize them. Consider T. brucei, which is the parasite that causes sleeping sickness. It has over 2,000 genes that code for proteins on its surface. Parasites are the masters of disguise. As soon as the immune system learns to recognize them, they can change to a form that makes them invisible again. Invisibility is a game changer in combat, and this is true at the level of bacteria and viruses as well. Some parasites create liposaccharide coats that are almost identical to human tissue, and it takes a very finely tuned immune system to deal with these kinds of parasites. If the immune system is too aggressive, it attacks the parasites, but also the tissue the parasites are mimicking. If it isn't aggressive enough, it leaves the parasites alone to replicate. Another trick parasites use is to trigger good microbiome bacteria into phenotypic drift to parasitic forms and then to attack us. This way, the immune system gets too distracted with overwhelmed with row bacteria to have the time or resources to deal with the parasites it can barely see anyway. These are just a few of the dirty tricks parasites have learned to use to trick our immune system over the last 500 million years. But the microbiome is 1 billion years old, and it's seen every trick in the book. Parasites are no match for a healthy microbiome. But most of us don't have a healthy microbiome. Let's go more deeply. Putrefaction and dysbiosis. The only things that are meant to enter the large intestines are oligosaccharides, those special sugars that we can't digest that the microbiome can, and fiber. However, if proteins, fats, and carbohydrates enter the large intestine, we have problems. If protein gets into the large intestine, Clostridia, a common gut bacteria, will turn them into toxic amines like putrescine and cadaverine, which is what are responsible for the smells of putrefying corpses, and ammonia. If fat gets into the large intestine, Clostridia turns it into ruterin, which is a broad-spectrum antibiotic like Cipro, acrolein, which is a highly reactive genotoxin, and trimethylamine, which causes arterial plaque. And finally, if carbohydrates get into the large intestine, it creates an overgrowth of candida and excessive gas formation. Protein, fats, and carbohydrates in the large intestine teach our microbiome to eat these materials, and that is asking for trouble. Why? Our internal organs and muscles are made of protein. Our brain, nerves, and cell membranes are made out of fat, and cartilage and connective tissue are made out of carbohydrates. So if we end up with these materials in our large intestine, we're teaching our microbiome possibly to go rogue, and if it escapes through a leaky gut, it can start eating our own internal tissues. How might we get protein, fat, and carbohydrates into the large intestine? There's a kind of spillover out of the small intestine. There's a couple of ways. Insufficient chewing, or poor digestive capacity, poor absorptive capacity, overeating, or a weak ileocecal valve. So if we just don't digest well, it's going to get there. Or if we eat more than we can digest, let's say you have a good digestion, but you just eat too much and you overwhelm it, then we can get these materials in the large intestine. And finally, a weak ileocecal valve, which is a little sphincter between the end of the small intestine and the beginning of the large intestine that's supposed to just let food go from the small intestine down to the colon, but if it gets jammed open or is dysfunctional, bacteria can reflux back upwards and food can get down before it's all the way finished digesting. Okay. If you see signs of this kind of effect happening, if you're getting food into the large intestine before it's completely digested, consider taking some digestive enzymes. One of the issues that can happen when the microbiome goes out of whack is SIBO, or small intestine bacterial overgrowth. And that's when the small intestine becomes colonized with bad bacteria. This is a complex topic. We'll get into it in the second part of the series. So how do you know if your microbiome needs help? Well, stool tests are great. They cost around $500. So I'm going to tell you how to do some basic testing at home for a few bucks. So you're going to ask yourself 5 questions. First, does your stool smell bad? A healthy microbiome creates stool that has a mild acidic smell, but doesn't make the whole house stink. That would be things like Clostridia would be generating, those toxic amines like cadaverine and putrescine. 2, how much toilet paper do you need? If you have a healthy microbiome, you wipe once and there's nothing there. The more toilet paper you go through, the sicker the microbiome. Transit time. How long does it take to go from when you eat food to when you go to the bathroom? It should be 18 to 24 hours. Now, here's a quick way to do this test. You take a tablespoon of liquid chlorophyll and wait to see how long it takes for your stool to first start turning green. Now, you might say, well, I'm not constipated, I go to the bathroom every day. Sure, but if what you're passing is something you ate 7 days ago and you've got a 7-day backlog, even though you go every day, if it's 7 days old, that's the transit time we're looking for. We want to make sure food goes from when you eat it to when it goes into the toilet, 18 to 24 hours. And we'll talk about how you can improve that as well. pH paper. You can get some pH paper and you can actually press it against the stool and measure the pH. You want to get the pH paper that goes from 6 to 8 because the ones that go from, say, 4 to 10, it's hard to tell there's such a wide range, it's hard to tell exactly where you're at. What you want is a pH of around 6.6. Now, a 6.6 pH doesn't mean you've got perfect stool, but if it's above 7 or below 6.2, it definitely means the microbiome is out of whack. And then gas production is a sign of a troubled microbiome. Okay, so if you've found that your microbiome needs a little help, what can we do to recover it? You'd think probiotics, but not really. Um, the probiotics you can find in stores are bifidus and lactobacillus, and these are the ones that are found in baby guts. They're not found in adults. In an adult, they represent, 0.01%, 1 part per 10,000 of the bacteria of the gut. So they're not major players in the gut. The reason they're being sold is because they're easy to produce. Now, modern science is working on getting us the actual probiotics we do need. The challenge is they don't grow well in laboratory conditions. You have to basically make a giant gut simulator and grow them in a giant synthetic gut. But they're working on it, and they actually have a few now that are useful. I suspect by the year 2030, we should be able to recover the microbiome with probiotics in a much more sophisticated way than we can do right now. But for now, probiotics are not all that helpful in recovering a microbiome. They're useful in the moment when you take them, but they don't colonize and they're not what you need. So where would you get the bacteria you need for your microbiome? Well, there's 3 reserves for your bacteria. The first is dormant cells. Remember, a lot of your bacteria, they're not functioning because they're hibernating. It's not that they're gone, they're just asleep because you haven't fed them. So as soon as you feed them the oligosaccharides they need, they'll wake up. You repopulate them oligosaccharides, they bloom. The second reserve is the appendix. Now, we're often taught that the appendix is a vestigial organ, a leftover from evolution. We don't really need it. Actually, no, it's the backup copy of your microbiome, so that if a person were to get salmonella or dysentery or something and get violent diarrhea and flush out their microbiome, they could repopulate from the appendix. Some of us have had our appendixes removed. Some of us have had our appendixes sterilized with intense antibiotics, so that isn't always a reserve for everyone. And the third is other people. Getting a microbiome from another person is known as a fecal transplant, but that's the topic for another podcast or another video. Okay, so since there are always some oligosaccharides in the diet, it's unusual for all the species of good bacteria to die unless you've done heavy-duty antibiotics or had a really difficult childbirth sequence. What's usually the case is they're just sleeping in small numbers. So mostly what we need to do is just give the microbiome the oligosaccharides that it needs, that it's not getting in its diet. And if you consider that a single bacteria with a doubling time of 20 minutes can generate 34 billion copies of itself in 12 hours, you realize it doesn't take long after feeding them for them to repopulate. So the takeaway here is probiotics are fine. We're not as advanced yet as we need to be, but oligosaccharides really are the key. It's much better to grow the ones you have that are hibernating than to take in ones that you don't really need and won't populate you anyway. All right, can you get enough oligosaccharides in your diet? Maybe, kind of, right? You'd have to eat a lot of foods you might not like. A lot of tubers, insects, mushrooms, seaweed, they'd all have to be on the menu. And you'd have to have really excellent digestion to be able to get the oligosaccharides out of these foods. So yes, you can eat a primitive oligosaccharide-rich diet. Most of us probably aren't going to do that. So once I realized I wasn't realistically going to do this with diet for myself anyway, I decided to make a mix of the oligosaccharides that I thought would simulate the intake of a successful hunter-gatherer. So I identified 8 key oligosaccharides that we need for a healthy microbiome and put them in what I thought was the right ratio and started taking it, and the results were amazing. So I made it as a product and started giving it to other people. It's called Panaceum. And it actually tastes pretty good because oligosaccharides are sweet because they're kinds of sugars. Don't worry, they're not the sugars that raise blood sugar. They're actually, oligosaccharides actually lower blood sugar because they normalize insulin sensitivity and such. So let me tell you what's actually in Panaceum. And there's the bottle, Panaceum. Okay, so it's got galacto-oligosaccharides that you find in tubers, xylo-oligosaccharides, pectin-oligosaccharides, and fructin-oligosaccharides you find in fruits and vegetables. Connective tissue oligosaccharides that are found in wild game, not so much the factory meat that we eat today. Chitin oligosaccharides that you would find in insects or mushrooms, although we don't get them from insects in our product. fucoid oligosaccharides found in seaweed, and the isomalto-oligosaccharides found in things like honey, miso, and kimchi. Why so many different oligosaccharides? Well, there's a few reasons. First, oligosaccharides act as decoy molecules to prevent pathogenic bacteria and fungi from attaching to the gut wall. So the wider range of oligosaccharides in your diet, the more protection your gut has against a wider range of parasites and predatory microorganisms. Second, different bacteria in your microbiome require different food sources, different oligosaccharides. So the greater the diversity of your oligosaccharides, the greater the diversity of your microbiome. And a diverse microbiome is a healthier microbiome. And third, oligosaccharides are not interchangeable. I had a friend who was 2 years into a worsening health crisis. Her chronic fatigue was unbearable for her. She could hardly take care of herself. And she did not present as having an imbalanced microbiome. She didn't really have a lot of gut issues. It was neurological and fatigue and inflammation. But when we gave her the 8 oligosaccharides, within a few days, her health had returned. And then what happened was we ran out of 2 of them, and then within about 3 days, she started collapsing again. And then we got those 2 oligosaccharides back in, and then her health returned. So what the takeaway for that is one, oligosaccharides are not interchangeable. You never know which oligosaccharide someone's microbiome is going to need for them to recover. And 2, if the microbiome is the problem, you can recover a lot faster than it took you to get sick. She was getting worse for 2 years, and she recovered in a couple of days. So the question is, can you just go out and buy some oligosaccharides? They're available. You can purchase them. Yes, but there's a trick to it. Most people have some degree of SIBO, which is small intestine bacterial overgrowth, and we're going to get into that in the next talk. If you give people with SIBO oligosaccharides, then what happens is some of the oligosaccharides will make it to the large intestine, but some of them will cause an overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestine, and so then you end up helping their large intestine at the cost of their small intestine. So what we did is we came up with a way of producing tablets under extremely high pressure. So we take the oligosaccharides and we compress them at really, really high pressure so that when you take them orally, they don't dissolve for about 12 hours. So by the time they start dissolving, they're already in the large intestine. And this is a way that we can feed the oligosaccharides to the bacteria in the large intestine where we want them, and not give them so much to the bacteria in the small intestine where we don't. In terms of personal benefits, so over the course of a month, my eyesight got better. I noticed my reading glasses became too strong for me. My physical strength improved. I have weights in my gym, in my garage, and I was able to do significantly heavier weight sets and more of them. My endurance improved just in terms of just being able to go for long hikes, not getting tired. And here's a 2 interesting one. My skin became more resistant to cuts and scrapes. One of the things I noticed as I've gotten older, I'm 53, is that my skin would tear and cut more easily. I live off grid, so I'm always, handling, sharp tools and wood and getting scraped up. And the other day, my foot got caught in the door, and I thought for sure I just ripped the heck out of my Achilles and the top of my foot. And it was red, and that was it. The skin didn't tear. Another one is my sense of balance improved. I've never had a sense of balance my whole life. I was never the kind of person that could stand on one foot and put a shoe off and on. And now I can. So that's interesting to me, because to improve the sense of balance, we're talking about microcirculation to the feet and the nerves and also in the brain. So I'm not quite sure why the microbiome did it, but I'm really grateful. And as I was thinking about all these things that improved on me, it dawned on me what they all had in common. These are all things that get worse with age. So eyesight, endurance, strength, balance, skin strength. These are all things that typically fail as we get older. So in return for feeding my microbiome these 8 oligosaccharides, it was returning the favor to me by making me physically younger, which I thought was pretty great. So what's the conclusion? The microbiome is an ancient intelligence with a lineage going back 1 billion years. It's a powerful ally, and it's been with you since before you were born, guiding and protecting and partnering with you. And all it's asking for all the gifts it'll give you, is some oligosaccharides.